Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe to the channel for regular content on ancient architecture, as well as all of the latest news from the world of archaeology. The Pre-Pottery Neolithic is such a remote era in the human story, a period of time spanning 11,600 and 9,000 years ago. And although many of you have heard about one particular site from this time, that being the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Göbeklitepe, you may be surprised to learn there are in fact dozens. There are settlements in the Levantine and Upper Mesopotamian regions of the Fertile Crescent, and their size and estimated populations vary. Göbeklitepe is of course the most famous, and it's also one of the largest. But just 36 kilometres to the east, there is another enormous site. This of course is Karahan Tepe, a site that's been excavated for the past few years, and the findings have been nothing short of astonishing. If you want some background information, I've got many videos you can watch, including site walkthroughs, drone footage and excavation updates. Therefore, I won't go into the finer details right now, but for those that are new to the subject, at the heart of the excavation area is a large oval building, what experts call a communal special purpose structure, and this is known as Building AD. Adjoining it is this fascinating space known as Building AB, where we find 10 bedrock pillars, another that's freestanding, a groove and a rim around the upper edge, as well as this haunting carving of a human head. Adjoining it is Building AA. This is far shallower than AB, but it has a deep pit cut into it. Together, these three structures form the focal point of the excavations, and were maybe the focal point of the entire site. Today, only a small percentage of Karahan Tepe has been excavated, so we don't know what we'll uncover next. Every settlement that's being excavated from this remote time seems to bring to light something new that's never been seen before, unique architecture and artefacts, and hence there are many interpretations out there already for so many of the pre-pottery Neolithic mysteries. But for me, one of the biggest mysteries has always been Building AB, the pillared structure, because it's just so unique. We don't find another structure quite like this anywhere else, and it's right in the heart of the site. I've looked at this structure for an unhealthy amount of time. I have an interactive 3D model on my computer, I have a 3D printed physical model on my desk, and I've always wanted to figure out what its purpose could be. Well, now I think I may have the answer. But before I get to the new idea, I'll just give you some brief background information. Structure AB has an oval plan and is approximately 7 by 6 metres in size. Its most striking feature is this carved human head, which is shaped from the bedrock and is located in the middle of the structure's western wall. Opposite the head are 11 pillars, and these are lined up inside the space, 10 of which are made from the bedrock, and one is a pillar that was brought in from the outside. It looks like a reused zoomorphic statue, maybe something like this. Archaeologist Nesmi Carroll says the 10 bedrock pillars are shaped like phalluses, and because they're carved from the bedrock, their location was determined when the building was designed. The rock had to be left in situ. At the southern end of the structure, there is a crude staircase connected to Structure AD, the large enclosure. Apparently, the slopes of the steps indicate that the structure was entered into from the adjacent building, through this porthole that measures 70 centimetres in diameter, while the slopes of the steps at the northern end maybe indicate that this was the exit. Today, the function of this structure is not known, but some believe it could have been a ritual space, where people entered on one side and left by the other, maybe like some kind of initiation or related to the rites of passage of puberty. According to lead archaeologist Nesmi Carroll, it's also believed that this structure was intentionally buried through a series of consecutive processes. A red soil containing no archaeological material, with a thickness of around 40 centimetres, was laid at the bottom of the enclosure. Then, a stony filling was added up to the level of the pillars. Stones were then placed on top of the shortest pillars in a way that could reveal their location when the enclosure was filled up to the top. Stone slabs were then placed on top of the fill, and this was to ensure it was completely covered over. Now, I totally respect the opinions of Dr. Carroll, and of course his insight into Karahan Tepe is far better than mine. But although I'm just an amateur, I have to say I question the interpretation of the fill, or the way the interpretation is presented, i.e. one specific, carefully crafted, layered filling operation, with stones stacked on top of where the pillars would be beneath the soil. To me, this idea doesn't seem logical or probable. I think a lot of what we see inside this enclosure is not quite as it seems, and in my next video on this subject, building on from this video, I'll be showing you a few of my observations that call into question exactly how this enclosure was made. But either way, without going into the finer details, we have a structure with 11 pillars inside, with a rim around the western half, and opposite there's a groove on the eastern half. They're the key takeaways, but why is it like this? What was it? How was it used? In context, we can't forget it's also connected to the large building AD, as well as the shallow enclosure AA, and surrounding these three structures are a large number of domestic buildings. We're looking at the beating heart of a large settlement, and so I have to think that structure AB did have a very specific purpose. Of course, there is already a lot of speculation over its use. In the past, I've speculated it could be a primitive hypercore system, others believe it was a cistern for water, some think it was a pit to keep wild leopards, and yes, many believe its significance was purely ritual. But for someone that researches the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, I always say that you can't just look at one site in isolation to try and understand it. For example, you can't really interpret the iconography at Göbeklitepe without considering all of the other sites, because they also show many of the same motifs. But is there anything like structure AB in a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement? I really didn't think so, but last week I stumbled on a paper by Ian Kite and Bill Finlayson, published all the way back in 2009. It was titled Evidence for Food Storage and Pre-Domestication Granaries 11,000 Years Ago in the Jordan Valley. Before even looking at the paper, the title got me thinking, where did the people of Karahan Tepe store their food? Yes, technically they were still hunter-gatherers, but this was very much a transition period in the human story, where people were living increasingly sedentary lifestyles. To allow such a large settlement to flourish, there was clearly social organisation, and having such a large population, in comparison to the seasonal camps of old, food storage would surely have been vital. The sedentary lifestyle and the social changes that come with it were likely what gave birth to agriculture, and as this paper discussed, there are other sites in the Levant that date back to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, and these contain sophisticated purpose-built granaries in a pre-domestication context. People were cultivating wild crops, and this was an early stage of the domestication process. So, regarding the function of structure AB at Karahan Tepe, has the answer been out there all along? A simple yet credible explanation, that it was made for food storage for the people of Karahan Tepe. Well, that's my bright idea, that what we're looking at is in fact the substructure of a granary. And after reading the paper by Kite and Finlayson, and looking at the examples they show, the architecture of the known granaries from the same period of history, well now I do think I'm onto something. Let me explain. The paper from 2009 looks at a site called Dhra, located near the Dead Sea in Jordan. It dates back to around 11,300 years ago, making it a pre-pottery Neolithic A site, active and populated at the same time as Göbeklitepe and Karahan Tepe. The site shows evidence of large-scale storage in sophisticated purpose-built granaries, and that's before the domestication of plants. As the experts say, the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic A were the first people in the world to develop systematic large-scale food storage. The Natufians who came before them did use a wide range of wild plants. They lived in well-built semi-subterranean structures for most of the year and no doubt had a strong knowledge of seasonality and resources. But surprisingly, there is a lack of strong evidence for large-scale food storage. As of 2009, only 3% of Dhra had been excavated, yet 4 granaries had been identified and they were interspersed between the oval enclosures and residential buildings. These granaries were oval in shape, measuring around 3 by 3 metres on the outside. Interestingly, and most importantly, they all have suspended floors, and this was for air circulation and also to protect the produce from rodents and insects, and also water. Straight away, the suspended floor made me think of structure AB at Karahan Tepe. Finally, I had found a similar structure, and it dated back to the same time. What's more, if structure AB was in fact the substructure of a granary, it may well make it the oldest granary ever identified. The granaries that we find at Dhra had an outer mud or pisé wall. Where structures were terraced into a slope, the riveting wall was made of stone. There is some evidence the upper parts of the walls may have had a lightweight organic frame to support the mud. The roofs of the granaries have not been preserved, but experimental research, together with the lack of any central post holes, suggests it likely had a flat roof and covered with a coating of mud. Looking at the granary labelled Structure 4, and it was built by placing notched stones upright along a subfloor. The stones were positioned between 1 and 1.2 metres apart, and they were arranged in lines, so that wooden beams could be held in place along the notches. The artificial floor that was supported by the stones sloped at an angle of 7 degrees, and this seems to be intentional. Maybe it was useful for storing or gathering loose material, or maybe in case any water got inside, it wouldn't just stand in place. It would drain towards one end of the granary, and then maybe down into the cavity below. The stones supporting the floor measured 35 to 50 centimetres in height, and while some of them were specially made, others were reused grinding stones. Large pieces of burnt wood were found in situ in the excavations. There were also lumps of burnt mud, and there were also impressions of vegetation. And this all suggests the structure had a raised floor of wooden beams, and they were covered with smaller plant matter and mud. Microscopic analysis of the fill suggests the floor and walls collapsed, maybe due to a fire, hence the burning. In the sediments, there were also numerous voids created by the presence and subsequent disappearance of barley. This indicates it was likely used as a temper, being incorporated into the mud. As shown on this diagram, and something we should bear in mind for Karahan Tepe, this granary was also a multi-phase structure. Phase 2 was smaller than the original. Most of the subfloor space had been filled in from the previous collapse, and the space was not cleared out again. Furthermore, a number of the upright stones were incorporated into the new wall of the structure, but it's possible that some of them were still used to raise the floor. Saying that, and there appears to be a solid floor surface sitting directly on the collapsed material. The experts believe the new structure was used for a more informal system of food storage. The structure was still raised above the bedrock, albeit far less efficiently. Experts say that the structures of Phase 1 and Phase 2 were each only in use for around 50 years, but there is even evidence that some of the granaries of Dhra were built over even earlier ones. Beyond the settlement of Dhra, granaries have also been identified at Netiv Hagdud, which date back to between 11,300 and 10,900 years ago. A structure known as Locus 26 is 3 metres by 3 and is defined by a mud enclosure wall. It is believed it likely had upright stones on the subfloor, but these could have been removed and reused later in history. We have many examples that show how the pre-pottery Neolithic people were practical, and they would often reuse materials. This is seen quite clearly at Göbeklitepe. At Jericho there are also 2 large mud installations, and they're located close to the famous tower, and they each date to the pre-pottery Neolithic A. They measure 3 to 4 metres in diameter, and the great Kathleen Kenyon believed they were storage structures. It is clear that people from this time were storing food seasonally, if not annually, on a scale that would have at least served as an important buffer for food shortages, but would have also created the context for potential social change. And we have to remember that evidence from the Levantine sites shows that people were storing wild varieties of plants and cereals, so the granaries are in fact pre-domestication structures. At Dhra, the granaries are found at locations between other buildings, and it's argued by some experts that as time went on, granaries went out of use, and crops were stored inside houses. So, in the pre-pottery Neolithic, we see the development from communal storage facilities to storage systems that are part of individual households. Food storage is an essential development for food production, sedentism and farming, and it represents a major evolutionary threshold for human civilization. And with all that in mind, when we look at sites like Göbeklitepe and Karahan Tepe, well, we know that food processing was taking place on a large scale, and that's because of the large array of stone implements discovered. But should we ask ourselves, where did they keep their food? Were crops stored inside domestic dwellings? Were they inside the special purpose communal structures? Were there developmental changes like we see further south in the Levant, where granaries were used first of all, before food storage went inside the home in later history? To date, no specific granary structures are known at Göbeklitepe, but at Karahan Tepe, I think we do have one in the form of structure AB. For a start, it's a prime location for storage, right in the heart of the site, and adjoining the large communal building AD. There are domestic structures all around, and, when excavated, many of them contain food processing artefacts. The structure is bigger than the granaries of Dhra and Netiv Hagdud, measuring 7 metres by 6, but the settlement was also much bigger. And why do I think it's a granary? Well, it must have had a function, and an explanation for these pillars is to raise the floor. I can't think of many benefits of having a sunken enclosure, which, as we can see from this modern picture, would just be prone to flooding. So, I think the pillars are there to raise a floor, and this is just like we see at Dhra in Jordan. Building AB has 1 reused pillar added to the structure, and also 10 bedrock pillars. And even though some of them look smaller, I do actually believe there is strong evidence they all once stood at the same height. I'll explain all this in a forthcoming video. There is also the lip on the western side of the enclosure, and a clear groove on the opposite side. Not to mention the fact that the top of the human head sculpture is perfectly flat, and lines up with the lip. The top of the head must have been flat for a reason. There is no doubt in my mind that the pillars, groove, lip and head supported a cover. But no, not a roof. I believe they supported a floor. I believe there was a room above the pillars, and now, after looking at other examples of pre-pottery Neolithic architecture, I think this could be a granary, a structure that by design requires a raised floor. But regarding the excavations at Karahan Tepe, there has been a real lack of detailed information published, so it is very difficult to prove the hypothesis one way or another. So, in the near future, I would love it if detailed excavation reports could be available to independent researchers. But if this is a granary, why do we only find the subterranean floor supports? Where is the actual structure itself? Well, part of it could actually be the fill. At Dhra, the granaries were built using mud or pisé, maybe with a partial organic frame, materials that generally don't survive the test of time. The granary at Karahan Tepe could have been built predominantly from mud, maybe plastered with a lime mixture, like what we see in some modern villages in India. But why use mud and not stone? Well, mud has excellent thermal insulation properties, helping to maintain a stable cool temperature inside. Mud can also regulate humidity, absorbing excess moisture from the air and reducing the growth of mould. The dense, compact nature of mud architecture can also be a barrier against insects and rodents. It's also an abundant, low-cost material and it's strong. When properly constructed, a mud granary can have very thick walls. In the modern era, mud is still used for granaries in some modern villages in Western Africa and India. So regarding Enclosure AD, we've not found remnants of any kind of superstructure, and we haven't found the floor. But if this was all made of mud and organic material, realistically, what would we find 10 to 12,000 years later? Probably layers of mud, stone and debris in the fill, and that is exactly what we see. And remember, if this granary was anything like the ones at Dhra, it could well have had many phases of use. It could have been decommissioned and filled in, and then covered over with stone slabs and reused. My granary hypothesis is the first phase of use for this structure. I actually think there could be 2 or even 3 phases of use. Many cultures, past and present, also raise the floor of their granaries off the ground, because this allows it to have ventilation. After harvesting, produce can continue to respire, taking in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide and water. This moisture can cause damp conditions. So, having the floor of the granary raised off the ground allows air to pass underneath it, and so stopping the problems associated with damp. And that's why any granary at Karahan Tepe would have had a raised floor. It's all to do with ventilation. Maybe this also explains why the carved head, which would have been beneath the floor, looks to be exhaling. His facial features could be telling us the purpose of the structure. He's blowing air. It's air circulation. Maybe it's some kind of primitive agricultural god, a god for food, or a god of the air and wind. Of course, I'm just speculating. But what was the purpose of the opening into building AD? Well, using Blender to add the floor above the pillars, and the opening looks to be beneath the floor. Its purpose could be to enhance ventilation, or simply to allow access. If it was a food storage structure, it means it was one of the most important, if not the most important structure of the settlement. The access point could be simply to clear out any pests, or just to allow access in case repairs are needed, or maybe if there was a flash flood, and there was a build-up of water beneath the enclosure. But then it hit me, because I've been looking at this structure and forgetting some key points I'd learned in my research over the years. We have to remember we're looking at how this structure ended up, and not how it started life, and I was overlooking some key anomalies. We have 10 bedrock pillars, but 4 of them are quite different. These 4 are taller than the other 6 bedrock stumps. This one was smaller, but as you can see, it has 2 stones cemented on top, and I think the rocks we see above the pillars in the fill once upon a time were also cemented onto their tops. But compared to these 4 pillars, why would they make 6 bedrock pillars so much smaller? Why not just leave them taller? Either there was a change in plan, or like what we see in the settlement of Dhra, maybe this granary had more than one phase of use. Looking at it from the top, and we can see it has a strange shape. The northern end curves in and then out again, as does the other side but to a lesser extent. What is very telling is that the 4 tall pillars are all positioned on the western side, and the smaller pillars are on the eastern side. The porthole from Structure AD also leads into the eastern side. Now, if we go back to Blender and lower the floor so that it's just above the small pillars, and the porthole is now an entrance into the granary itself, looking just like this artist's impression of Dhra. I believe that the 4 tallest pillars mark the western limits of the original Phase 1 granary, so the original subfloor looks something like this. A long oblong space with 6 bedrock pillars, and maybe some loose stone pillars, and these supported beams that would have been anchored to the bedrock, and then a floor was laid on top. The only way into the granary was through the large communal structure AD, which likely means the leaders of the settlement had control over the food, and that was through the large building. Maybe it was designed like this to keep the food secure, or maybe to secure the position of the settlement's leader. The granaries we find at Dhra are only thought to have lasted for 50 years at a time, and so, at Karahan Tepe, I think the original structure either failed, fell into disrepair, or the decision was made to enlarge it. For Phase 2 they widened the structure, added 4 taller bedrock pillars, and also carved the human head. They raised the floor just high enough so that the porthole was now an entry point into the substructure, not into the granary itself. Maybe the old design was flawed. Maybe it would flood, and because of the old design, there was no access to beneath the floor. Maybe the floor often needed repair work, or maybe there was just not enough airflow to remove the excess moisture. Whatever the reason, the floor was raised, the granary was widened, and the porthole now gave access to the substructure. I can really only speculate about Phase 1. All we can see today is how the structure ended up, so really I've just focused on Phase 2. Like the granary at Dhra, it's also worth noting that the Phase 2 floor looks like it would have had a gentle slope, maybe by about 3 to 5 degrees, as we can see in this cross-section on Blender. Right now, this hypothesis is really in its infancy, but hopefully it's something new to think about. There is still a lot more to consider, for example the nature and purpose of this channel. Is it something contemporary or something that came later? If it is to transport water, in my opinion, it actually looks to flow away from structure AB, not into it, and this would make more sense. It's short and leads nowhere and could just be there to take water away. But what's the purpose of structure AA? Could this also be another storage building? I think that this enclosure was very much a work in progress. It's unfinished, and that's why we see only a small pit inside it. This is because there's a large number of cup holes on the floor, and we know that this is how the ancient people dug large stone pits, by creating cup holes close together and then knocking out the thin walls between them, and then the process is repeated until they reach the required depth. Interestingly, the level of the bottom of this pit is pretty much the same as the base of structure AB. I think we're looking at another similar structure, but this one was a work in progress and unfinished. I think they were digging this enclosure to make another granary, but was it planned to be an extension of Enclosure AB, but the work was simply unfinished? And maybe this isn't a channel, but it's related to quarrying activities to remove this patch of natural rock. There is a shallower parallel line right next to it, so maybe they're related to the processes to remove the rock. I do have so much more work to do on this hypothesis, including some 3D modelling. But in truth, there is only so far I can go, and that's because of the lack of available data from Karahan Tepe. To see if the hypothesis really stands up, we do need more information regarding the fill of the structure. The mud and stone fragments that filled the structure could well be the decayed floor and outer walls of the granary. I do think my interpretation is logical and realistic. This could be the oldest granary ever discovered in the world. Right now I've got so many research projects ongoing, all of which need a lot of work, and I'll be presenting all of my ideas on the Ancient Architects channel. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.